Imagine living in a world where eating tomatoes could get you executed, where wearing purple was a crime, and where your house's color decided your social rank. From medieval kitchens that banned women to Victorian laws about how high your dinner plate could sit, history is filled with rules that make today's world look like pure chaos. In this video, we're diving into the strangest, most absurd, and downright unbelievable laws about food, clothing, and housing that once controlled entire civilizations. During medieval Japan's Edo period, citizens couldn't eat luxury foods like white rice or salmon unless they were samurai or nobility. Commoners were forced to mix rice with millet or barley to appear humble. Inspectors even tasted random bowls during festivals. Anyone caught eating above class faced public shame or confiscation. The Tokugawa government believed excessive pleasure through food weakened loyalty and discipline, so flavor itself became a matter of law. Meals had to match your rank, not your hunger. In ancient Rome, emperors banned extravagant banquets that included flamingo tongues and peacock brains. Under Emperor Tiberius, a law called *Lex Fania* strictly limited how much food citizens could serve at feasts. Hosts who disobeyed were fined or exiled, but the rich found loopholes, serving rare animals for religion. One senator famously roasted 1,000 eels covered in pearls just to mock the law. Rome's war on indulgence became a theater of absurd luxury disguised as piety. In 18th century France, before the Revolution, servants weren't allowed to wear lace or silk, even if their employers gave it to them. The fabric itself was seen as a symbol of class contamination. Tailors could be arrested for stitching noble patterns onto peasant clothing. Markets had guards who snipped off illegal lace collars. These textile police enforced hierarchy through fashion, reminding people that their birth, not their taste, decided how they looked. Wearing silk became a political act of rebellion. Victorian England had a law forbidding women from showing ankles in public, calling it visual indecency. Some towns like Bath even employed modesty inspectors at social gatherings. If a dress rode too high during a dance, a fine could be issued. Newspapers described ankles as provocative joints. Even table legs were sometimes covered to avoid suggestion. Ironically, this era obsessed over morality while fueling underground fetish markets for forbidden glimpses of fabric and skin. Modesty became its own form of madness. In 15th century Florence, a bizarre housing law required citizens to paint their houses dull earth tones, no bright blues, reds, or golds, unless they were church officials. Color was considered sacred property of God's representatives. Painters who ignored the rule could lose their workshop license. This divine hue decree turned neighborhoods into muted clay cities, while cathedrals glowed in holy pigments. The poor could stare at color but never live inside it. Even their walls had to worship hierarchy. In 17th century China, under the Qing dynasty, it was mandatory for men to shave the front of their heads and wear the rest in a Manchu queue braid. Refusing this hairstyle was seen as treason against the emperor, punishable by beheading. The rule symbolized loyalty, not fashion. Thousands died resisting, shouting, "Keep my hair, lose my head." Barbers became political enforcers, and hair became history's most chilling mark of obedience. A strand out of place could mean execution. In 17th century China, under the Qing dynasty, it was mandatory for men to shave the front of their heads and wear the rest in a Manchu queue braid. Refusing this hairstyle was seen as treason against the emperor, punishable by beheading. The rule symbolized loyalty, not fashion. Thousands died resisting, shouting, "Keep my hair, lose my head." Barbers became political enforcers, and hair became history's most chilling mark of obedience. A strand out of place could mean execution. During the early Ottoman Empire, laws dictated shoe color based on religion. Muslims wore yellow, Christians black, Jews blue. Anyone violating these tones could be flogged or fined. Footwear became a public declaration of faith and a silent form of segregation. Even the tanners were restricted from mixing dyes for the wrong group. Travelers described Istanbul's streets as walking rainbows of control. One step in the wrong color could trigger arrest. Your identity began literally from your feet. In medieval Ireland, a strange law called Brecon Housing Code stated that a noble's home must always face east, so morning light touched the lord's doorway first. Commoners' houses faced west, symbolizing dusk and submission. Builders caught reversing orientation could be punished by dismantling their homes. The architecture enforced cosmic hierarchy. Nobility lived by sunrise, peasants by sunset. Even sleeping direction was dictated by birthright. Walls weren't protection, they were instruments of invisible obedience. In 14th century Venice, it was illegal for women to eat certain seafoods like oysters or eels in public because they were considered lust-provoking. City guards patrolled canal-side taverns to catch indecent consumption. Women accused of erotic dining faced social humiliation and exclusion from festivals. The church called it protecting virtue from appetite. Yet, ironically, the same priests held private feasts drenched in forbidden dishes. Morality was selective. Appetite was sin only when seen. In 18th century Russia, Tsar Peter the Great banned long beards and heavy robes, calling them symbols of backwardness. Men caught with full beards had to pay a beard tax or have it forcibly shaved in public squares. To prove payment, citizens carried small copper tokens stamped with a nose and mustache. Those without it faced humiliation. This reform wasn't just about looks. It was Peter's war on tradition, forcing Russians to appear Western. Facial hair became a rebellion against progress. In medieval France, bakers could be executed for selling bread that weighed less than promised. The assize of bread law set strict standards for loaf size, price, and quality. Inspectors randomly weighed bread in markets, and anyone cheating even slightly was tied to a post, smeared with dough, and publicly mocked before imprisonment. Paris considered bad bread a moral offense. Cheating hunger meant cheating God. Bread wasn't just food, it was a holy contract between ruler, baker, and belly. In 19th century Korea, during the Joseon dynasty, widows were legally forbidden to wear bright colors. They were expected to dress only in white or gray until death, symbolizing purity and grief. Violators faced exile or forced head shaving. Even festivals required them to sit apart, covered head to toe. The rule turned mourning into a lifelong sentence. White became both armor and prison, trapping women inside the memory of their husbands. The color of death became their second skin. In 13th century England, King Edward III issued statutes of apparel, banning peasants from wearing clothes lined with fur. Only knights or higher ranks could enjoy that luxury. Even if a farmer killed his own animal, wearing its pelt was treason against the social order. Market inspectors cut fur collars off offenders in public. The logic was absurd. Warmth was considered privilege. Nobility monopolized comfort while peasants froze under the law. Fashion in that century was literally survival with rules. In ancient Egypt, only priests and pharaohs were allowed to eat fish during certain religious months. The Nile was full of life, but commoners caught eating sacred species like Nile perch risked punishment or mutilation. The ruling class claimed fish carried souls of the gods and that ordinary mouths polluted divinity. Ironically, these same priests held feasts of roasted perch behind temple walls. Holiness was reserved for the powerful, while the hungry worshipped from a distance, through the smell of their meals. In 17th century Scotland, a bizarre law made it illegal to eat meat on Wednesdays, Fridays, or Saturdays unless you were sick, and you needed a doctor's note to prove it. The rule aimed to boost the fishing economy and control Catholic fasting habits. Inspectors raided taverns sniffing for roasted lamb or beef. Offenders were fined or imprisoned. Citizens joked that God rested on Sunday, but man starved on 3. Diet became politics and faith became hunger enforcement. In 15th century Spain, during the height of the Inquisition, Jews who converted to Christianity, known as conversos, were monitored for eating habits. If they avoided pork, it was proof of false faith. Neighbors spied on meals. Officials inspected kitchens for missing ham bones. Families cooked pork stew publicly just to survive. What you ate decided whether you lived or burned. Dinner became a daily test of loyalty. The smell of bacon wasn't appetite, it was camouflage against death. In medieval Germany, sumptuary laws dictated even the size of women's sleeves. If the fabric extended wider than 1.5 hands, the offender could be fined or have it cut off on the spot. Tailors faced punishment too. The obsession with sleeves came from belief that excess fabric symbolized vanity and sin. But noblewomen turned rebellion into fashion, stuffing sleeves with flowers and hidden jewelry. The church called them walking sins, yet the streets called them freedom stitched in silk. In 16th century Italy, the city of Venice banned unmarried women from wearing pearls, fearing it would make them look too wealthy and tempting for marriage. Only married noble women could legally sparkle. Street inspectors known as asterisk, ornamento guards, asterisk, patrolled festivals, snatching jewelry off undeserving necks. Many women secretly sewed pearls into hems or veils. What glittered on their bodies could destroy reputations or families. Beauty itself became evidence of sin, and love became regulated by law and luster. In 18th century America, during the Puritan era, bright clothing was considered sinful. Town laws in Massachusetts Bay Colony forbade red cloaks, lace, or silver buttons, calling them Satan's vanity. Children were punished for wearing colored ribbons. Tailors could be fined for selling fancy cloth. Churches even preached that God saw humility through dullness. Yet diaries from the time reveal secret gatherings where villagers wore hidden reds under coats, proof that even the most pious souls still longed for color. In 12th century China's Song dynasty, tea was so revered that commoners were forbidden from owning porcelain tea sets. Only scholars and officials could sip from white-glazed cups, considered symbols of enlightenment. Ordinary citizens had to drink from crude clay bowls. Inspectors confiscated illegal porcelain, sometimes smashing cups in public to humiliate offenders. Ironically, tea, meant to unite, became a divider of class. A single sip from the wrong cup could brand you as arrogant, an unworthy imitator of refinement. In 18th century England, chimney taxes determined how wealthy you appeared. Each chimney meant a higher tax, so poor families bricked up vents, suffocating themselves in smoke just to save money. Inspectors counted chimney tops from the street, fining anyone who tried to hide heat. London's skyline of fake bricked stacks became a monument to absurd governance. The rich warmed in mansions, the poor coughed in soot. Even warmth, something as invisible as breath, became a privilege written in stone and ash. In ancient Sparta, eating in private was illegal. Citizens were forced to dine together in communal mess halls on bland black broth, made from pig's blood, vinegar, and salt. The law aimed to erase luxury, enforcing military equality. Anyone caught eating alone risked disgrace or exile. Even kings had to share bowls. Flavor was considered weakness, privacy disobedience. Sparta's meals weren't nourishment. They were discipline served hot, proof that loyalty meant swallowing the same bitterness as everyone else. In 17th century Japan, sumptuary laws dictated not just what fabrics people could wear, but how wide their house gates could be. Peasants' gates couldn't exceed 5 feet, while samurai homes could stretch 12. The gate was your rank, your literal entry into society. Carpenters measured openings with rulers of law, not wood. Offenders had gates torn down overnight as public warnings. In a world obsessed with hierarchy, even your doorway became a biography written in planks and shame. In 19th century Ireland, during the potato famine, landlords painted evicted tenants' cottages black with tar to mark failure. It was illegal to repaint or repair them without paying a fine. The black houses stood like tombs of hunger, haunting villages long after famine ended. British officers called them moral reminders of laziness. For the poor, they were graves made of memory. A man's home wasn't his castle. It was his curse, branded with starvation by decree of empire. In 14th century Mongolia, the Great Khan banned eating food with the left hand, believing it invited evil spirits. Offenders were whipped or forced to eat ashes as purification. The left hand was unclean, reserved for the dead. Feasts had guards watching for wrong gestures. Travelers from Persia recorded nobles dining in silence, terrified of moving incorrectly. Even hunger bowed to superstition. A single misplaced bite could summon spirits, or soldiers. Etiquette became exorcism disguised as table manners. In 18th century France, under Louis XV, women were forbidden from wearing men's riding coats, unless granted police permission slips called permission de travestissement. These papers expired every 6 months. Without them, women caught dressed as men were fined or jailed. Yet, these same coats offered safety while traveling alone. Fashion became bureaucracy. Your outfit needed government approval. It wasn't rebellion to wear a jacket. It was paperwork. The rule proved how control disguised itself in silk, buttons, and signatures. In ancient Persia, it was once forbidden to light household fires without royal permission during the New Year festival. Nowruz. The flame symbolized divine order, and lighting one too early was seen as stealing sacred time. Inspectors patrolled villages to ensure every hearth waited for the royal signal. Those who disobeyed were forced to extinguish fires with bare hands. The rule turned warmth into ceremony. Obedience burned brighter than flame. Even light required permission to exist. In 15th century Bohemia, beer brewing was a legal privilege reserved only for city council members and church monks. Villagers caught making their own ale were flogged, their barrels smashed publicly. Beer was considered holy craft, tied to divine fermentation. This monopoly birthed black markets. People brewed secretly at night, hiding barrels under beds. When inspectors found one, families were exiled. For centuries, the taste of rebellion in Bohemia wasn't political, it was the forbidden scent of malt in the air. In 17th century Italy, the Papal States enforced a strange rule, banning women from eating artichokes because they were believed to provoke lust. The Church claimed the vegetable's shape and taste stirred immoral desires. Housewives caught buying them were interrogated. Vendors could lose licenses. Ironically, noblewomen hosted secret artichoke banquets, serving them dipped in honey as quiet protest. The law's absurdity became its downfall. Desire, it seemed, could not be outlawed by vegetable. Morality wilted under its own appetite. In 16th century Sweden, it was illegal to serve coffee. The king believed it caused rebellion and unnatural thinking. Police confiscated cups and beans, while mock executions of coffee pots were staged in town squares. Anyone caught brewing faced interrogation. Despite this, underground coffee clubs flourished in basements, symbols of defiance and intellect. The aroma itself became a political statement. In Sweden's war on caffeine, each forbidden sip was a quiet act of resistance against royal paranoia and state control. In 19th century Paris, law forbade women from wearing trousers unless riding horses. Those who disobeyed could be arrested for cross-dressing. Even after 2 centuries, the rule technically stayed active until 2013. During revolutions, women like Louise Michel wore pants to fight, making clothing an emblem of equality. The government feared fabric would ignite rebellion. For over 200 years, a pair of trousers symbolized threat, courage, and blasphemy. It wasn't about legs, it was about who had the right to stand. In ancient Greece, citizens of Athens were banned from eating beans during elections. Philosophers claimed beans contained souls of the dead and clouded judgment. Some priests said they trapped spirits of unborn children. Polling stations even checked breath for bean scent. Pythagoras himself forbade his students from touching beans, believing they carried voices of ancestors. This superstition fused democracy with ghost lore, turning a humble meal into political taboo. In Athens, truth and fear boiled together in the same pot. In ancient Greece, citizens of Athens were banned from eating beans during elections. Philosophers claimed beans contained souls of the dead and clouded judgment. Some priests said they trapped spirits of unborn children. Polling stations even checked breath for bean scent. Pythagoras himself forbade his students from touching beans, believing they carried voices of ancestors. This superstition fused democracy with ghost lore, turning a humble meal into political taboo. In Athens, truth and fear boiled together in the same pot. In 15th century France, bakers had to swear oaths before God that they would not bake at night. The church feared darkness hid cheating, like using cheaper flour or stealing holy grain. Anyone caught baking after sunset faced whipping or exile. But bread still needed warmth before dawn, so underground ovens glowed in secret. The smell of early bread became rebellion's perfume. For some, those forbidden loaves weren't just food, they were proof that hunger always breaks before law does. In 17th century England, it was illegal to eat meat during Lent unless licensed by a bishop. But the rule was so corrupt that anyone could buy a meat pass for money. Poor citizens were jailed for eating bacon while nobles feasted on venison under religious exemption. Priests preached restraint with greasy hands. The church turned sacrifice into currency. Hunger was holiness only for the poor. In the kingdom's grand hypocrisy, salvation had a price, and it came salted. In medieval Japan, Buddhist monks passed a decree banning the consumption of any four-legged animals, calling meat the voice of suffering. But samurai continued eating in secret, disguising beef as mountain whale. Shops labeled forbidden meat under poetic names to fool inspectors. The emperor's ban lasted centuries, reshaping cuisine itself. Entire recipes vanished into metaphor. In Japan's silence of flesh, even hunger had to lie beautifully. The cruelty wasn't in the slaughter, but in the pretense of purity. In 14th century England, King Richard II banned servants from wearing shoes with long pointed toes, called poulains, because they threatened moral decay. The fashion symbolized arrogance. Officials measured toe length. If it exceeded 2 inches, shoes were cut mid-street. Ironically, nobles flaunted absurdly long ones, some curling upward like horns. The longer the toe, the higher the rank. Footwear became moral theater, piety for peasants, vanity for kings. Even walking was staged hierarchy where your step could condemn or exalt you. In 19th century China, women of Manchu ethnicity were banned from binding their feet, while Han women were encouraged or even pressured to do so. It was the only time beauty laws were divided by ethnicity. The Manchu saw foot binding as barbaric, yet it spread as a mark of grace and obedience. Daughters broke bones to rise socially. Palaces became museums of agony. A woman's steps, or lack thereof, decided her family's fate. In that silence of silk and pain, identity became deformity. In 16th century Venice, the Doge banned private gardens for commoners, claiming greenery is for nobility. Ordinary citizens were fined for planting flowers visible from streets. The law aimed to preserve beauty as class property. Some defied it, tending secret vines inside attics and courtyards. When inspectors caught them, plants were uprooted and burned publicly. Flowers, symbols of life, became contraband. Venice bloomed in secrecy, proving that even under tyranny, humans still plant beauty in hidden soil. In 17th century Denmark, a royal decree forbade servants from eating pastries on Sundays. Sweet dough was declared a luxury for those with divine favor. Bakers could be fined for selling to the lower class, and inspectors patrolled church exits to sniff for butter or cinnamon. One servant caught with a pastry-faced public whipping. Ironically, nobles threw away leftovers to prove virtue. Hunger became holy, and sugar a symbol of sin. Pleasure in this kingdom was punishable by sweetness. In 15th century England, Parliament passed a law banning anyone under the rank of knight from wearing hats decorated with feathers. Plumes symbolized honor and divine right, and peasants flaunting them were accused of mocking heaven's hierarchy. Guards snatched feathers off heads in taverns and markets, yet smugglers sold foreign ostrich plumes in secret, calling them clouds of rebellion. Every feather became a political statement, a soft, beautiful insult to power. Vanity turned into quiet revolution stitched on a brim. In 18th century Prussia, citizens needed government approval to paint their house exteriors. Only military officers could use bright colors. Civilians were restricted to gray or brown. The rule aimed to enforce discipline through dullness. Violators were fined or made to repaint under supervision. Towns looked uniform, lifeless, obedient. But some painters rebelled by mixing forbidden blues under night lanterns. They called it painting in the dark. Even color in that gray empire required courage to exist. In 13th century Italy, Bologna enforced bread peace laws, banning the baking of loaves too large or too small. Bakers had to match a government-issued model bread displayed in the city square. Any deviation was a crime against civic order. Inspectors compared loaves using carved wooden molds. The penalty for irregular bread was flogging or loss of trade. The logic, uniform loaves meant social harmony. In Bologna, bread wasn't nourishment, it was submission measured in ounces and fear. In 16th century Japan, only nobles were allowed to eat white rice daily. Peasants were legally required to mix in millet, barley, or beans. Inspectors tested grain color at tax collections. Farmers caught polishing rice faced confiscation of crops. The government claimed it preserved equality, but it really preserved hierarchy. Rice whiteness became status itself, a visible proof of privilege. The elite feasted on purity while the poor chewed humility. Even grains had ranks in the empire of hunger. In 19th century England, the window tax charged homeowners based on how many windows they had. To avoid paying, people bricked them up, creating eerie blind houses across London. Light became luxury. Poor families lived in perpetual dimness to save a few coins. Newspapers mocked it as a tax on air and daylight. But the government insisted it encouraged thrift. Health declined, mold grew, and tuberculosis spread. Proof that greed can block out even the sun. In medieval Egypt, tailors weren't allowed to make shoes taller than 2 inches for commoners. Height signified divine closeness. Pharaoh's family wore towering sandals of gold, while peasants trudged barefoot through burning sand. One craftsman who gifted his daughter elevated sandals was executed for imitating holiness. The rule carved divinity into footwear. To stand tall was blasphemy. The desert itself became a metaphor, endless, flat, and ruled by those who dared to step above the rest. In 18th century France, King Louis XIV banned commoners from eating asparagus during spring festivals. The royal kitchens monopolized the crop, calling it food for the sun's children. Peasants, caught growing or selling it, risked prison. Smugglers disguised asparagus as green onions, whispering grass of angels in markets. The plant became forbidden elegance, royal green for royal blood. Every stalk sold in secret was a rebellion wrapped in leaves. Even vegetables in Versailles bowed before the crown. In 15th century Scotland, homes were taxed according to how much smoke escaped from the chimney. Hearth taxes made warmth an expense. Poor families burned wet moss to reduce smoke visibility, filling homes with choking fumes. Inspectors stood on hills counting plumes above villages. Some families faked smoke by lighting damp straw to seem poorer. Survival turned into performance. The air itself became a counting paper, and Scotland's hills breathed the absurd mathematics of misery. In 13th century China's Yuan dynasty, wearing red shoes was punishable by death for anyone but imperial women. Red symbolized life force and heavenly power. Palace guards inspected markets, confiscating crimson cloth, yet folklore spread of peasants wearing hidden red insoles to walk with luck. It was rebellion in miniature, a secret soul of defiance under layers of mud. When rulers tried to color-code destiny, even dirt became sacred disguise. Humanity always finds a way to walk unbowed.